Hi, and welcome back to the NCL Workshop. We're going to review Part 2 of the Auxiliary Basics course in this presentation. The threat of war was looming on the horizon in 1940, and many changes took place in the decade that followed. In response to the anticipated needs of the nation, the Legion's birthday on March 15, 1941 was designated as Registration Day, and auxiliary members were to register for voluntary service in any emergency that might arise. Approximately 25% of all auxiliary members registered. Members took civil defense courses and campaigned for funds for the new USO, and they collected aluminum, a needed wartime material. A vigorous Americanism campaign was launched, and membership exceeded the 500,000 mark, a goal the auxiliary had promoted for several years. On Sunday morning of December 7, 1941, 9,326 units pledged the support of 523,000 members of the American Legion Auxiliary to the Commander-in-Chief of the United States. Just 2 months after Miss Mary Murrell of Massachusetts had taken office, the United States was at war again. Auxiliary members in Hawaii distinguished themselves by their service of caring for the thousands of victims of the attack at Pearl Harbor. The newly formed Emergency Voluntary Service Committee provided tens of thousands of auxiliary members who gave valuable service to the Red Cross, the USO, Civil Defense, Selective Service Boards, Army and Navy Relief, and dozens of other agencies that emerged overnight. 6 blood units were purchased and presented to the Red Cross. A book unit and mobile library went to the troops in India via the Red Cross, bearing the name of the American Legion Auxiliary, and blood for the wounded soldiers was donated by the gallon. The 22nd National Convention in Kansas City was attended by delegates only, and the traditional social events were suspended. Convention action abolished 4 national standing committees: music, emblems, trophies, and awards, employment, and education of orphans of veterans. In 1942, the auxiliary began a campaign to enlist women in the armed forces who would relieve men to serve in combat duty. The successful campaign led to the enlistment of 913 of the auxiliary's own members. The National Executive Committee authorized the disbursement of $50,000 to pay for the cost of nurses' training for the women who would have been unable to afford the training otherwise. The women of the auxiliary were engaged in nearly every form of the war effort activity. The first women to be eligible for membership through World War II service were enrolled in the auxiliary in 1943. Action of the Legion's 1942 National Convention gave eligibility to some of the World War II service personnel. Among the first to be eligible were widows and the families of the wounded who had been discharged because of disability. The majority of World War II service-connected women would not become eligible for membership until victory brought honorable discharges to the armed services personnel, and the returning veterans were enrolled in the American Legion. Absorbed in wartime activities, units tended to neglect membership, and 4,520 members were lost. The child welfare program took on new problems because of the disruption of family life, and the two organizations spent over $2 million in 1943 helping 500,000 children. Continued wartime activities occupied the energies of the auxiliary, and in the fall of 1944, the Liberty ship SS Moina Michael was launched in Savannah, Georgia. The ship was named in honor of the woman who had originated the idea of wearing poppies as a tribute to the war dead and whose work had contributed greatly to the development of the Auxiliary Memorial Poppy Program. The national president, Miss Helen Lee Gilbert of Connecticut, was attending the United Nations Conference on International Organizations as associate consultant to the American delegation when the word came from Europe that Germany had surrendered. Peace in the Pacific followed soon afterwards, and the post-war work began. The sudden dawn of peace brought new demands for the services of America's largest patriotic organization of women. The men and women who had won the war were coming home, and thousands of them were disabled. Widows and children of those who would never return would require the auxiliary's compassionate aid. A 5-point program was designed to strengthen the loyalty of Americans to democracy. This program encouraged active Americanism in the home, the unit, in youth and adult groups, and in the community. Enrollment in the auxiliary climbed to 750,000 members, a gain of 150,000 members in 1 year. The years passed and membership grew, the result of the eligibility of World War II service-connected men and women. Girls' state programs were held in every department, and the first Girls' Nation was held on the campus of American University in Washington, D.C. in August 1947. During this year, under the direction of National President Miss Dorothy Pearl of Michigan, the National President's Scholarship grew from 5 to 10, and a project was endorsed to raise $500,000 for heart disease research. In 1947, Pan American Study was made a year-round activity. Housing for war veterans and their families, rehabilitation of a new generation of disabled veterans, care of needy children, and concern for the prevention of another global conflict were the primary concerns of 1948. The Legion, backed by the Auxiliary, pushed for universal military training. More than 30,000 letters and 1,600 telegrams were sent to Congresswomen urging passage of such a bill. The National News, the official publication of the Auxiliary, took on a more important role and was sent to every senior member. At the winter meeting of the National Executive Committee, $50,000 was presented to the American Legion for the expansion of the Legion's rehabilitation program. A station wagon was purchased for use at the U.S. Marine Hospital in Carville, Louisiana, replacing one previously provided by the Legion. There was increased public awareness of the Auxiliary through 12,000 radio broadcasts, and 13 broadcasts went out over the new medium of television. With the National Convention in Philadelphia in 1949, the World War II period of the American Legion Auxiliary ended. On the domestic front, the Auxiliary went into action against communism in the United States. The emphasis on Americanism grew. Leighton K. Hurst joined the staff and began working on improving and enlarging the radio script library at national headquarters. The 1950s arrived, and with the invasion of South Korea, the Auxiliary again raised its voice in support of the Legion's demand for military training for all young men. In September of 1950, President Harry S. Truman announced that the armed forces would be increased from 1.5 million to 3 million. That year, a new high in membership was reached, with 975,000 members recorded. A new committee, Civil Defense, was appointed, headed by past National President Miss Dorothy Pearl. The 26th Women's Patriotic Conference on National Defense convened in Washington, D.C. on January 24, 1950, and marked the last conference in which the American Legion Auxiliary would participate. The Auxiliary held the position that it could not partake in the adoption of policy resolutions, since the Auxiliary followed the policies established by the American Legion. The rehabilitation program was broadened, with personal gifts from the Auxiliary given to 185,000 veterans in hospitals on Christmas Day of 1952. The first Women's Forum on National Security was convened on January 24, 1953, in Washington, D.C., under the direction of National President Miss Eve Ashton of Utah. 700 representatives from 10 of the largest of America's national patriotic organizations attended the first meeting. An all-time high of 1 million plus members was reached in 1955. The first Knee to Lift booklet for students was published that year by the American Legion. The Washington, D.C. office was opened in 1956 under the leadership of Leighton K. Hurst, program coordinator. The 1950s were marked by the launching of Sputnik by the Russians, the rising of power of Fidel Castro in Cuba, and the ending of the Korean War. During the 1960s, our membership continued to decline, and it didn't recover significantly until 1976. There were constant protests against the government because of our involvement in Vietnam. Young men were refusing to answer the call to military service, and patriotism took a dip until the late 1970s. Construction of the Berlin Wall, the Cuban crisis, and the assassinations of President John F. Kennedy, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., and Robert Kennedy created additional stress throughout the nation. The national president, Miss Opal Glenn, visited Saigon during her 1965-1966 administrative year, and she was able to see firsthand the ravages of war on our military. In 1966, with the signing of the approval documentation by President Lyndon B. Johnson, Vietnam veterans became eligible for membership in the American Legion. That same year, the Philippines established a department of the American Legion Auxiliary. The year 1969 brought many firsts to the American Legion Auxiliary. It was the year the Auxiliary Emergency Fund was made possible by funding from the Helen Colby Small estate. This fund provides temporary financial assistance for members of the auxiliary. The first voluntary insurance programs were offered to our members. Granddaughters became eligible for membership in the American Legion Auxiliary during 1970. This change would help the membership grow again toward the goal of 1 million members. The 1970 National Convention in Portland, Oregon was full of tension for everyone involved as confrontations with protesters marred the daily proceedings and created immense security problems. Among all the turmoil, the first national vice president of the American Legion Auxiliary was elected. Bertha Parker of Oklahoma was the first to hold the office of national vice president. During 1973, the first Vietnam POWs were released, and auxiliary members wearing POW MIA bracelets watched for their special POW to be among those coming home. That same year, the Cavalcade of Memories was established in national headquarters, with 3 rooms set aside to display auxiliary memorabilia. Our nation endured painful events during 1974 and 1975, with the resignation of both the President and Vice President of the United States, and the fall of Vietnam to the Communists as our troops withdrew. Membership in the auxiliary, however, continued to grow, and it reached the highest count in 20 years during our bicentennial celebration year in 1976. The American Legion and American Legion Auxiliary had raised funds for 5 years to purchase a replica of the Liberty Bell to ride on the American Freedom Train during America's 200-year celebration. Millions of Americans saw the results of that effort as the Freedom Train crisscrossed the United States. America's bicentennial was uniquely celebrated by a joint Boys and Girls Nation session in our nation's capital. The American Cancer Society received a $1 million donation from the American Legion and American Legion Auxiliary in 1976 as a result of a year-long fundraising campaign. That same year, the American Core-Asian Foundation Open Heart Program became a part of the Children and Youth Program. Units were asked to contribute funds for airfare to bring children of South Korea to the United States for open heart surgery. With the continued energy crisis in the United States, the American Legion Auxiliary focused its attention on solutions by establishing the Energy Conservation Committee during the 1976 and 77 administrative year. Changes to the national headquarters staff occurred during that same year when Miss Peggy Sappenfield was appointed to the position of National Treasurer following the retirement of Miss Minor Freeman. National President Viola Molson, national president from 1977 to 1978, was seen on national television as she presented a check in the amount of $261,000 from auxiliary members to Jerry Lewis for the fight against muscular dystrophy. Special Olympics was added as a regular emphasis in the Children and Youth Program during 1978. Miss Miriam Jung from the Department of Ohio was appointed National Secretary of the American Legion Auxiliary in 1978 by National President Maxine Bigelow upon the retirement of Miss Doris Anderson. The auxiliary has continued to fulfill its purpose by working hand in hand with the Legion. The basic programs of Americanism, Children and Youth, National Security, Veterans Affairs and Rehabilitation, Girls State, and Legislative continue to be as important today as they were in the 1920s. Committees have been added and dropped, and titles have been changed, but the same basic ideals upon which America was founded remain in the hearts of the women and men of the American Legion Auxiliary. The auxiliary is still striving to keep unsullied the idealism that has guided the nation and to bring to the citizens of America a fuller realization of the responsibility of citizenship. This concludes Part 2 of our NCL Workshop Auxiliary Basics course. Feel free to take a break, and when you're ready to continue, please see Part 3